Dr. Dirk Quadflieg is a professor of philosophy of culture and cultural theory at the University of Leipzig. His research area is modernity, confronting modernity in the areas of theory of culture and social and political philosophy. He's author of several books, among them Vom Geist der Sache, Zur Kritik der Verdinglichung, Differenz und Raum zwischen Hegel, Wittgenstein und Derrida, and Sein der Spache, Foucault's Genealogie der Moderne. This is the third lecture in this cycle, although it totally works as a standalone lecture. You didn't need to hear the previous two ones. So after presenting us the concepts of after presenting us his thoughts on concepts of social totality in a rather absolute actuality in Hegel and truth as a method of thinking social totality, and then and that was on Tuesday, and then yesterday Marx's notion of Gattungswesen. Today the two lines connect in the lecture with the title A Radical Possibility of Totality, Blanchot's Concept of Communism. Dirk, thank you for coming, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me first thank Strauke Kobe and the Faculty of Arts and the Goethe-Institut for making this possible, and also, of course, Martin Hergot and Goran Fornesevich, who can unfortunately not be here, for organizing this event, and all of you for coming and maybe coming again. I'm really happy about that. In today's lecture, I will try to bring together, as Martin already mentioned, central topics that are dealt with in the preceding lectures in readings of Hegel and Marx, namely totality and what I translate as genus being, Gattungswesen. And I will do that in a perhaps unexpected way. Unexpected because I would like to open up a whole new perspective. Is there something? I'm fine. I'm mehr Licht. Yeah, the famous Goethe, so talking about the end, then of course you need more light. No, I'm totally fine. Thank you. I will bring together these two topics in a perhaps unexpected way. Unexpected because I would like to open up a whole new perspective on these concepts with the help of a short text by Maurice Blanchot, which appeared in 1964 under the title The Apocalypse is Disappointing. There are two reasons for this change of perspective. Firstly, the new framework will, or so at least I hope, make the problems developed in the previous lectures more accessible to those of you who have not attended them. Secondly, Blanchot's text makes it possible to transfer the reflections of Hegel and Marx not only into the middle of the 20th century, but also to our present day. Admittedly, the apocalyptic threat that Blanchot had in mind in the mid-1960s was that of the nuclear extinction of all humanity, and thus a possibility that has perhaps been less of a concern to us in the last 30 years. Nevertheless, today we are once again confronted with an omnipresent scenario of threat that affects humanity as a whole and that we can describe, rather superficially, as climate change. Certainly, the climate catastrophe that is becoming increasingly apparent differs in many respects from the fantasies or phantasms usually associated with the nuclear end of times. Both are human-made, but while a nuclear war could still be imagined as a singular event of active self-destruction, so someone presses the red button, ecological self-destruction extends over such a long period of time and has so many unforeseeable consequences that it is difficult to imagine the end as an end. And yet, despite the obvious differences, the current debate on human-made climate change is, too, characterized by a certain apocalyptic tone, which was already the starting point for Blanchot, and also we can also find that in a later text by Derrida. In any case, Blanchot is less concerned with the reality or actuality of nuclear self-destruction than with the possibility that arises for the question of human coexistence if we think of it in terms of its end or its negation. One of the many astonishing twists in his short text is that Blanchot takes the real possibility of a self-induced end of humanity as an opportunity to reflect on the concept of communism. Most important for that is a certain idea of humanity as a totality that is not yet real, that does not yet really exist, but paradoxically only appears through the possibility of this extinction of the whole. To connect this directly to a central consideration from yesterday's lecture, one could connect the idea of humanity as a whole directly to Marx's idea of the genus being, which also does not yet exist and can likewise only appear in the anticipation of its end in a relation to its absolute negation. I will come back to this in a bit and would simply like to quote Alenka Zupancic at this point, who also dealt with this text by Blanchot and came to a similar conclusion. Namely that, in other words, the bomb or imminent apocalypse gives rise to the idea of the whole, but remains disappointing in the sense that this whole is in fact empty of any concrete content and form. People are bound together, united, only by their common disappearance and not by any real form of global community. The totality that is about to disappear, if the bomb does go off, doesn't really exist yet as a meaningful totality or whole." End of quote. As is well known, 7 is a number closely associated to the book of the Apocalypse, so I will proceed in 7 steps, which, however, do not strictly build on each other, but rather, based on Blanchot's text, illuminate the question of totality, the human being, and communism from different angles. In a German version of the paper, I used the difficult-to-translate phrase Wurfsendung for these 7 reflections. In everyday language, the term typically refers to an advertising brochure or an information letter that is thrown unwantedly into your letterbox. But if you break the German word down into its two components, Wurf and Sendung, a number of different associations with reference to the biblical apocalypse arise, such as fate, destiny, being thrown, or with regard to the medium of testamentary transmission techniques, meanings such as missive, letter, dispatch, epistle, etc. So when I tried to translate the German word, I came across the Old English term consignment, which has a slightly different but similar rich horizon of meanings. Consignment is primarily used as an expression for the delivery of or shipment of goods and therefore has a strong economic connotation. However, the Latin root of the word already indicates that it is a special delivery, namely one that is signed or sealed. A certified transmission, one could perhaps say. In any case, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the original meaning was only that something was sealed or authenticated. Sealing or dedicating with a sign is one of the meanings. The Apocalypse to John famously speaks of a book with 7 seals that are being broken open. To break the seal of the consignment would therefore also be read in such a way, that a tradition that was previously considered sure, a certain economic tradition, is broken open in a yet unknown way. An interruption of the transfer or transmission, if you will, but one that is in a certain sense inherent in the delivery itself. This is why I would like to deliver my lecture in form of 7 consignments, hoping that it does not remain the book with 7 seals. So, first consignment. Is it possible that the apocalypse is disappointing? this seems somewhat unlikely, because if the apocalypse really would happen, if the end of the world were to become reality, there would be no one left who could regard this event as a disappointment, at least no human being. And if there were survivors who, however unlikely, would find the doom of the majority of humanity disappointing, would it be a real apocalypse or an apocalyptic reality from the point of view of these survivors? Hence, can the apocalypse as such ever be disappointing? How would that be possible? It can certainly be argued that Maurice Blanchot is not talking about the apocalypse itself, but about a radical possibility, namely the historically new possibility that humanity will destroy itself through the use of nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, Blanchot's text does not deal with the concrete process of possible self-destruction, which cannot be grasped as such anyway. We can only imagine it, as no one has any experience of the apocalypse, let alone a nuclear one. The question that troubles Blanchot is rather whether the technical possibility of nuclear self-destruction of humanity represents a historical turning point, an event in the strong sense. If there is such an event, then it does not lie in the future reality of total annihilation, the realization of which necessarily remains a phantasm, because by definition there can no longer be anyone who could state in the form of a proposition that the nuclear apocalypse has taken place. Rather, the event takes place or has its place, its site, in the effects of this radical possibility on the present. So, however probable or improbable the nuclear apocalypse may be, if it is an event in form of a possibility, it only ever affects our present, and first of all, us, in an emphatic sense of the human community as a whole. And in doing so, it also affects our reflection on this end itself, and thus above all philosophy, which is traditionally responsible for these very last things. These first approximations already indicate that Blanchot's short text, The Apocalypse is Disappointing, is, strangely enough, neither about the nuclear apocalypse nor about the salvation of human beings, at least not in the same sense as in Karl Jasper's book, The Atomic Bomb and the Future of Mankind, against whose religious gesture of "turn back, the end is near," Blanchot's entire essay is directed. The question he poses instead, and in contrast to Jasper's, is whether the possibility of a nuclear self-destruction does not paradoxically open up a new, different future for the human being. A future that would depend on a radical redefinition of what it means to be human, and which only reveals itself when the possibility of total destruction becomes real. Blanchot's considerations are apparently based on the thesis that the historically new power of absolute self-destruction, which looms on the horizon of the near future in the form of nuclear armament, makes the idea of a totality of humanity conceivable for the first time. Astonishingly enough, he associates this totality to a free realization of the human community, a form of communization that, according to Blanchot, must be called in the full sense communist. End of quote. The thesis would therefore be that the possibility of communism only reveals itself on the basis of this new insight into the finitude of humanity, in other words, in relation to the end of humanity or its being toward death. Second consignment. Blanchot thus draws a completely different lesson than Karl Jasper's from the historical new possibility that the human being can destroy itself through the use of nuclear weapons. Jasper's does not categorically oppose nuclear armament only because he sees the free world threatened by Bolshevism. In this respect, for Jasper's, the problem of the atomic bomb proved to be a dilemma, that confronts every individual with the impossible choice between totalitarian domination or annihilation. Yet, as Blanchot notes, the demand for a radical change in one's own existence derived from this by Jaspers ultimately amounts to a simple decision in which the all too familiar false opposition of freedom and totalitarianism is reproduced. And this could already be read as a first indication of the extent to which the apocalypse can actually be disappointing. Namely when, as with Jaspers, it is initially invoked as a turning point and radical change, but ultimately only serves to confirm prevailing philosophical or political patterns of thought. Jaspers' assertion that the utterly new situation created by the atomic bomb demands a new way of thinking, together with that calls for a transformation of human being, is countered immediately by his own conventional philosophical response. With regard to Jaspers' book, The Atomic Bomb and the Future of Mankind, one could therefore say that it is above all the traditional way of thinking in Western philosophy itself that is disappointing in face of the possibility of the apocalypse. Anyone who invokes an absolute new situation that requires a complete conversion, but in fact does nothing other than in his reaction then refer to the all too familiar Christian motive of metanoia, conversion and repentance, is obviously contradicting himself. Although Jaspers raises the right question, for Blanchot he merely uses it as an alibi or a means of pressure for bringing us to spiritual or political decisions that have already been formulated long ago and independently of it. Seen in this light, the apocalypse, at least in the way it is instrumentalized here, can indeed be a disappointment. Against this, Blanchot wants to maintain that the event named with the atomic bomb is in fact only revealed through a radical new thinking. Apocalypse thus stands not only for a total annihilation, a meaning that is given to it in our use of the word by the revelation to John, but also stands, according to the Greek sense of the word, for the process of unveiling or even revelation itself. Accordingly, the historically new situation of a possible nuclear annihilation can also be called apocalyptic in the sense that it makes something hitherto invisible appear or something alienated visible. What the event of the apocalyptic foreshadows in this way is described by Blanchot as follows. Insofar as it puts, I will skip some of the quote, insofar as it puts into question the human species in its totality, it is also because of this event that the idea of totality arises visible and for the first time on our horizon. However, it is anything but obvious why totality should only now, with the atomic bomb, appear for the first time. This much seems clear. Totality in this case cannot simply mean the concept of humanity, which already exists, nor the quantitative enumeration of all human beings, which, however exclusively this group was conceived, is more of an empirical datum, or at least that of an approximate estimation. But what can the idea of totality mentioned by Blanchot refer to if it addresses more or something else than the idea of an inclusive wholeness of all human beings? Perhaps this is precisely the problem of philosophy and our traditional way of thinking, which is not yet capable of grasping the totality that reveals itself for the first time with the atomic bomb. If we follow the scattered hints that Blanchot's text gives, there is at first a rather negative suggestion that the concept of totality could refer to a still pending connection between the thousands of human beings divided according to the model of a singular individual. End of quote. So instead of merely adding them up externally, the idea of totality would aim to unite the countless human individuals populating the earth for the first time as a human community. Although Blanchot often speaks of a wholeness, for example, humanity does not yet exist as a whole, totality seems to refer to a principle of unity, which he sometimes addresses as with the traditional philosophical name of reason in response to Jaspers. I will give you a quote later on. Third consignment. One way of understanding this idea of totality is through Blanchot's own connection to communism. It seems not too far-fetched to trace the missing principle of communization back to Marx's early writings, where a very familiar figure of thought can be found under the title of genus being, borrowed from Feuerbach. To be sure, the reference to the concept of the genus, which appears particularly in the Paris manuscripts of 1844, has led to the widespread view that the critique of alienated labor developed here is still based on strong anthropological presumptions, which Marx abandoned in his later work when he turned to a critique of political economy. Althusser and his school therefore speaks of an epistemological break in Marxist thinking, which can be dated around 1845 and be traced back to the German ideology. I just recall this debate primarily because, according to Althusser, the young Marx still follows traditional philosophical thinking and, measured against his later critique of philosophy, was himself arguing ideologically in this phase. At least for some time, Althusser tries to capture the break in Marxist thinking terminologically with the change from philosophy to theory, written with a capital T. So that one could say that the break with the early work in some sense also means the end of philosophy. However, if we stay with Marx's early writings and the repeated reference to the human being as a genus being, it is certainly true that a whole series of formulations from this period give the impression that Marx was ultimately presenting his critique of alienated labor against the background of a quasi-Rousseauistic idea of human nature. Already in the knowledge of what the true human nature would be, the genus being, the industrial labor relations of his time are rejected as alienated. Such a reading, of course, leads not only to the notorious question of how Marx knows about the true nature of human beings, despite all their alienation. Furthermore, the premature identification of the concept of genus being with an underlying nature of the human being runs the risk of advocating a naturalistic anthropology. Well-known formulas from the Paris manuscripts, such as that communism as fully developed naturalism equals humanism, and as fully developed humanism equals naturalism, have done their part to support such suspicions. Without going any deeper into a discussion of Marx's concept of nature, which is already much more complex in his early writings than the quote suggests, I will focus solely on the two interesting aspects of Marx's concept of genus being that prove helpful in deciphering Blanchot's thought. And those of you who have been present yesterday will find some of them, that what I developed there now again. The first aspect concerns a temporal structure that appears in just a few passages of Marx's work, but is all the more significant because it makes it possible to see more in the concept of genus being than the dangerous naturalization or essentialization. Already in the introduction to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx states in the context of his critique of religion that religion is the self-consciousness and self-esteem of man who has either not yet found himself or has already lost himself again. End of quote. And in a similar way, I give you now the longer quote, and in a similar way, on the Jewish question, he criticizes the Christian character of the contemporary concept of democracy because in it, man ranks as sovereign, as the highest being, but it is man in his uncivilized, unsocial form, man in his fortuitous existence, man just as he is, man as he has been corrupted by the whole organization of our society, who has lost himself, been alienated and handed over to the rule of inhuman conditions and elements. In short, man who is not yet a real genus being. End of quote. The not yet of the human genus, the pending state of the human being, which Marx clearly expresses in both passages, corresponds with the striking semantics of becoming, which also appears in the more detailed passages on genus being in the Paris manuscripts. The essence of the genus would therefore be by no means consist in fixed physiological characteristics or specific mental faculties of the human being that could be clearly and exhaustively enumerated. Rather, what would be essential for the human genus being would be the very openness of not yet being determined. Moreover, this essential openness would also be both the reason and the necessity for self-determination, in other words, the freedom of human being. Exactly because the essence of the human being is not determined, or to use Hegel's terminology, is determined by negativity, it is free to determine itself. The realization of genus being therefore means nothing less than such a free self-determination of the human community, and indeed, here Blanchot's formulation is quite appropriate, a self-determination as a whole. If one takes this fundamental temporal structure of the not yet, emphasized by Marx, seriously, alienation cannot actually mean that human beings live in social conditions that contradict those of their pre-given nature. Although this is true to a certain extent, it is only true insofar as the normative point of reference of such a critique is not an already fixed determination, but rather the still pending future possibility of a humanity that understands itself as a genus, that is, as essentially belonging together. Consequently, the entire critique of alienation must be turned inside out, just as Marx will later say that Hegel's dialectics must be turned inside out in order to free it from its mystical shell. Human beings are not alienated from their genus being because they have moved further and further away from a previously realized essential determination or identity with themselves. Rather, the diagnosis of alienation refers conversely to a historical form of society that fixes and predetermines human beings in their behavior and thinking in such a way that the open horizon of the genus, their possibility of free self-determination as genus beings, is blocked. In other words, the human being would be alienated from its future possibility and not from a past reality. Closely related to this, the second important aspect of Marx's concept of genus being lies in the special relationship between the individual and the genus, which distinguishes the human beings from animals and at the same time establishes the fundamental openness of the not yet. For unlike the animal, which coincides directly with its genus life, the human being is characterized, according to Marx, by the fact that in its activity it relates to its genus. Man makes his life activity itself the object of his will and of his consciousness. He has conscious life activity. It is not determination with which he directly merges. It is just because of this that he is a genus being. Or it is only because he is a genus being that he is a conscious being, that is, that his own life is an object for him. Only because of this that is his activity free activity. End of quote. to be a or the genus being means to relate oneself to one's genus in order to become an individual in the first place, and not merely to exemplify external generic determinations. The gap thus indicated, the non-coincidence of individual and genus, is a prerequisite for conscious activity, and this in turn represents the starting point of all freedom. All of this underlies the above-mentioned necessity of turning the critique of alienation inside out. Human beings are free beings because by relating to their genus, they simultaneously distance themselves from it, that is, they are not directly identical with it. Consequently, to become aware of one's own activity means nothing other than to reflect on oneself as a general genus being, to relate to oneself in the mode of the universal. Being a subject that can say I, therefore always implies a fundamental split between the individual and the genus, the particular and the universal. But by being constituted by a split in its essence, the human subject is only alienated from itself precisely when it is unable to realize this essential split. For example, because it lives in social conditions whose reproduction demands clear identities and identifications, and thus systematically disguises its genus activity. If one understands Marx's recourse to the concept of genus in the temporal manner of a pending future, it further becomes clear why in the early writings he can describe private property in particular as the secret of alienation within bourgeois society. Although private property certainly represents a historical prerequisite and the motor for a rapid development of the division of labor and the increase in productive forces, it furthermore produces an abstract type of human existence in which, quote, the sole purpose of life and existence is direct physical possession, end of quote. This form of existence is abstract because, on the one hand, individuals perceive themselves as separate from the society, and society as an independent entity, and on the other hand, because the manifold central relationships of human beings to the world are reduced to the single sense of possessing, of having, end of quote. Marx counters this appearance of subjectivity brought about by private property with a dialectical relationship between the individual and society that takes into account the particularity of the individual as well as its social basis of existence. In this context, he almost incidentally introduces a concept of totality that leads us back to our initial question. Man, much as he may therefore be a particular individual, and it is precisely his particularity which makes him an individual and a real individual social being, is just as much the totality, the ideal totality, the subjective existence of imagined and experienced society for itself, just as he exists also in the real world both as awareness and real enjoyment of social existence and as a totality of human manifestation of life, end of quote. Totality here obviously does not stand for an all-inclusive quantity of all human beings, but rather denotes the way in which the individual expressions of life are both an expression and confirmation of social life, without directly coinciding with it. As we have already seen, this is, according to Marx, precisely where the decisive difference to the animal lies. Now, however, in order to at once speed things up a little and summarize the points that have been worked out so far, it must be noted that such a totality, even from Marx's point of view, has not yet been actualized. This next step to the way to its actualization would be the abolition of private property in communism, which is the necessary form and the dynamic principle of the nearest future, nächste Zukunft. But, as Marx stresses, not the goal of human development, the form of human society. Let us note, communism is not the end, and yet it is more than a mere possibility. It is the name of the principle of the nearest future, hence the actual phase necessary for the next stage of historical development in the process of human emancipation and rehabilitation, as Marx continues. Fourth consignment. This will not have been the last word, especially since the last words in the Marx quote I just read, namely rehabilitation, implies a repetition that seems to call back into question everything that has been developed so far with regard to the temporal structure of the not yet. If rehabilitation really meant the return to a previously realized but then forgotten origin, Althusser would have been right. The early Marx would ultimately not have gotten beyond either Feuerbach's anthropology or metaphysical thinking of origin. If, by contrast, one emphasizes the fact that for Marx, communism represents a principle of the future, but not its goal, then one can draw a connection line to the principle of unity that Blanchot refers to as the totality of human community and also as communism. In contrast to Jaspers, this totality of communism is not synonymous with totalitarianism, since it stands for a principle of human communalization in which the individual can realize its particularity in reflection on its constitutive universality. As set out above, the genus being of the human being is characterized precisely by the fact that the individual essentially lives in a certain distance to its own genus and thus frees itself from its natural determinations. As a result, the human being is by no means completely removed from nature, nor does it face society, its second nature, as an external given. That this nevertheless can appear so is due to the alienating effect of private property, on which the capitalist relations of production and its own ideology of liberalism are based. Yet the human being is not already free as an individual, not free by nature, as it were. As a genus being, it is a totality, and its subjective existence is inextricably linked to social existence. Accordingly, and to speed things up even more, it can be stated at this point that the free human being can only exist in a liberated humanity. As long as humanity as a whole is not liberated, no individual can be truly free. This is the reason why the genus being of the human being as a totality is still pending. However, due to the inner logic of how freedom is actualized in and as totality, the endurance and future of communism cannot be imagined as a telos that is achieved once and for all after a phase of upheaval and revolution. The actualization of this totality does not simply put an end to what was previously only possible and transforms it into the existence of a reality. Rather, the phrase, the dynamic principle of the nearest future, with which Marx describes communism, should be understood literally as the moment of movement which opens the present towards a future. This future is the next future in the strong sense that it transcends the present in a hitherto unknown way and does not merely extend it in time or expand it along the familiar path of thought and action. The principle with which the future announces itself is therefore itself nothing other than a specific form of possibility that can only become real as a radical openness or a new space of possibility. In this respect, the nearest future refers to something that is still to come and always remains to come, the contents of which can neither be foreseen nor be generally declared as realized at a later point in time. Marx clearly took a very similar view and specified this shortly after the manuscript in the German ideology co-authored with Engels, namely in the following quote, "Communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. More clearly than before, it is stated here that communism is in fact, in the first instance, only a name for a principle of movement that leads beyond the present. Fifth consignment. If communism represents a principle of movement that enables a new way of seeing the future, this will also necessarily change the nature of the revolution. In another short text titled Marx's Three Voices, which precedes the essay on the disappointing apocalypse in the anthology Friendship, Blanchot also draws this conclusion. As he points out here, Marx, in his view, describes revolution not as a necessity whose time has come, but as imminence, because it is the trait of revolution, if it opens and traverses time, to offer no delay, giving itself to be lived as ever-present demand. In Blanchot's reading, revolution does not mean a historically unique turnaround that is followed by the kingdom of freedom, like the apocalypse is followed by the kingdom of God. If the revolution consists in opening up new and completely different possibilities, and it is precisely this principle of opening or revelation that characterizes communism in the full sense, like Blanchot calls it, then the revolution does not represent a mere point of transition to a final telos, but is as such already the goal, or as Marx said, the dynamic principle of the nearest future. In and as a principle, however, communism then stands for nothing other than a permanent revolution. Contrary to Marx's own way of speaking in the Paris manuscripts, where communism appears more as a transitional stage, the free totality of the human community named with it must always remain to be future if it is to become actual. As Derrida has already worked out in his extensive discussion of Blanchot's text Marx's Three Voices, communism as such a future consequently consists of an opening without an end, and thus necessarily remains always to come, avenir. The greatest difficulty in understanding Blanchot's interpretation of communism is undoubtedly the peculiar combination of totality and permanent opening, because the extent to which the principle of an yet unknown future can also be a principle of unity appears puzzling at first. The opposite seems more plausible at first glance. A permanent revolution of the existing and its opening towards an indefinite future are obviously much more suitable for breaking up any formation of unity and constantly calling it into question. However, the convergence of the conflicting movements become clearer when one remembers that Blanchot's reflection on totality are based on the new and radical possibility of humans' nuclear self-destruction. According to Blanchot, it is to this possibility that we owe the idea of totality which arises visible and for the first time on our horizon. Nevertheless, what humanity could be as a totality appears only negatively, precisely at the moment when its own end becomes visible. In other words, only in the improbable act of self-destruction would the unity of the human genus reveal itself. Yet such a communalization through and in the apocalypse is obviously paradoxical. Firstly, the possibility of human community, if it should indeed lie solely in total self-negation, cannot become real without destroying itself in the same act. Its reality would not only be the end of its possibility, but its absolute impossibility and unreality. Thus, the possibility of totality can once again only lie in another form of the possible, namely in a possibility that realizes itself as by always remaining in the coming, as the nearest future. And secondly, as Blanchot emphasizes, this possibility currently exists only in the form of a technical power to end the lives of all human beings. Nevertheless, it is not only unlikely, but literally unthinkable, that total annihilation will result from a collective decision, because humanity does not yet exist as a collective deciding and acting subject. Consequently, we are faced with the double paradox that on the one hand, the unity of the human community can only appear in its disappearance, precisely when it no longer exists. But on the other hand, this united humanity is something that cannot even be destroyed because it does not exist, end of quote. The double paradox can itself be understood as an expression of the fact that the totality of the human community, that which according to Blanchot could be called communism in the full sense, so that the totality of the human community begins to reveal itself only indirectly and disguised at the horizon in the face of the threat of nuclear annihilation. Indirectly because although the act of nuclear self-destruction can be understood as an act of freedom, its consequences make it impossible to say anything about what the human community, which in the total self-destruction would have become both the subject and object of history, could be beyond this absolute act. Moreover, the image of a nuclear suicide marks the fact that the decision on the use of nuclear weapons currently lies in the hand of a few governments or head of states. But those persons are by no means capable of representing humanity as a whole, since it neither exists as a unity, nor could it ever be represented by such supreme heroes of the negative, as Blanchot called them, an idea which Blanchot explicitly characterizes as childish. The only meaning of such an image, therefore, can just lie in the fact that I hope I have the right quote, that men could be shown all that they are lacking. Yes, this is the part of the first quote. So the only meaning of such an image, like destroying yourself, committing suicide, as united humanity, the only meaning of such an image, therefore, can just lie in the fact that men could be shown all that they are lacking in order to reach the decision of a death said to be voluntary, whose subject would be the world. In this respect, too, the prophesied nuclear apocalypse is disappointing. Under the given circumstances, it would simply not be a self-empowerment of humanity. At best, the phantasm of a collective suicide as a supreme act of freedom gives an idea of how far away, quote again, real freedom, the achievement of human community, in other words, a totality that must be called, in a full sense, communist, still is. 6. Consignment. Now the question is whether this double negative finding, that first, the free totality of the human community only reveals itself as that what is missing, and second, that the atomic apocalypse, as invoked by Jaspers, is not able to grasp this negativity. So now the question is whether this double negative finding also brings Blanchot's reflection on the possibility of communism to an end, or whether it really opens up a probable, improbable possibility of totality and communism. The probable, improbable is a quote from Blanchot. If one follows Blanchot's text, then despite all the disappointment regarding the nuclear apocalypse and its conventional philosophical appropriation, he at least seems to attribute a certain power to negativity as such. It is certainly no coincidence that Blanchot in this context refers to the phrase of a tremendous power of the negative, which Hegel uses in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit to describe the capacity of the understanding to differentiate, analyze, and abstract. By recalling this tremendous power of the activity of understanding in Hegel, Blanchot responds on the one hand to Jaspers, who unilaterally associated the understanding with a mechanical thinking of feasibility and therefore wants to complement it with a comprehensive concept of reason as a political ethical counterweight. Against such a simple dichotomy, Blanchot insists with Hegel on a dialectical relationship of the two sides, a totality, if you will, in which the negativity of abstract understanding simultaneously provides the precondition and the energy for the life of the spirit, as Hegel calls it. And does not Marx also follow Hegel's idea of subjectivity, which only wins its truth by finding its feet in the absolute disruption? End of quote. This is a quote by Hegel. When he describes the human genus being as a conscious and therefore free activity that emerges from the difference, the non-coincidence of the individual and the genus. At this point, it is only a small step until all these moments come together in such a way that they find an expression, albeit a distorted one, in the real possibility of atomic annihilation. For precisely between the sentence about the understanding as the tremendous power of the negative and the one about the life of the spirit, which finds itself in absolute disruption, Hegel includes this equally famous passage about death. Death, if that is what we wish to call that non-actuality, is the most fearful thing of all, and to keep and hold fast to what is dead requires only the greatest forces. However, the life of spirit is not a life that is fearing death and austerely saving itself from ruin. Rather, it bears death calmly, and in death it sustains itself. End of quote. In the light of these few sentences from the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit, it does not seem entirely absurd to read Blanchot's whole text, The Apocalypse is Disappointing, as a Hegelian Marxist response to Jaspers, which again brings into play a dialectical entanglement to counter Jaspers' separation of understanding and reason. In the face of nuclear threat, however, there's much more at stake than a mere philosophical debate. What is at stake is the future of the human being, the question of the extent to which the future remains an open possibility, in other words, the question of freedom. In order to actualize this freedom, it is not enough, as Jasper and the liberal tradition suggest, to simply keep the future open, to hold back the end by, for example, accepting a certain degree of military deterrence in order to prevent totalitarianism. This would only be sufficient if human beings had already actualized their free being in principle, if human freedom was already a reality, at least in a limited way. Freedom that only, or at least for the most part, merely had to be defended against its enemy. In this case, then, no radically new thinking would actually be necessary. The knowledge about the human being and its freedom would already have been achieved, perhaps even absolutely. Yet if one doubts this liberal narrative together with Marx and Blanchot, and wants to criticize it as an expression of alienation, then this has consequences not only for the political interpretation of the historical situation, but also for the concepts and the conceptual relations in which a critique can be articulated. Such a critique does indeed require a radical new thinking. Seventh and last consignment. We're nearly done. The end is near. The intention of what has been said so far was to make plausible why a certain concept of totality is necessary for critical theory of our present time, and to what extent the thinking of totality differs from totalitarian thinking, as well as from a closure or end of history. It is certainly not easy to understand the concept of totality in this way, because the term suggests something else. But this seems to be exactly the decisive merit of Blanchot's reflections, which firstly link the possibility of thinking this totality back to a very specific historical situation. Let's simplify. The atomic age, but perhaps we should just say capitalism. And secondly, place this possibility in a different relationship to the future and its actualization. I would like to conclude by briefly examining the second point, which has so far been discussed primarily with regard to the future of communism, from a perhaps not entirely unexpected but certainly not improbable perspective. To take up an idea that has already been presented, we could first remind ourselves that the possibility of the apocalypse does not lie in its future reality, which would mean nothing other than the absolute end of all possibilities, which kind of would also be disappointing. Yet a non-disappointing mode of apocalypse could be sought, as Blanchot says at one point, in our relations to totality, which are only revealed through the real possibility of the apocalypse. In view of this improbable possibility of an absolute end of humanity, a thinking of totality that aims at the liberation of humanity would accordingly have to arrive at a different concept of freedom than liberalism. For such a connection between freedom and possibility in the face of death, there is, of course, a model. The being towards death, spelled out in Heidegger's Analytic of Dasein. For Heidegger, too, only the relation to one's own death reveals a structure of wholeness which is unveiled in the anticipation of one's own death, Vorlauf in den Tod. Death, as the end of all possibilities, throws Dasein back on itself, as it were, and thereby opens up its most intrinsic ability to be, its existence as a possibility. In Heidegger's words, being toward death as anticipation of possibility is what first makes this possibility possible and sets it free as possibility. As a certain relationship to one's own mortality, the anticipation of death discloses both the wholeness and the freedom of the human being that comes to itself in the liberation to its own being possible. Of course, one must be careful when drawing a parallel between the ontological structure of Dasein as presented by Heidegger and the human community as a wholeness. Despite the close proximity to Blanchot's figure of a totality that only reveals itself with the possibility of its end, a whole series of attributes that Heidegger ascribes to the anticipation of possibility obviously do not apply to the totality of the genus being that was elaborated before with reference to Marx as the communism of the nearest future. Nevertheless, maybe precisely in stressing the differences, there is a possibility of opening up Heidegger's existential ontology to a new way of thinking the human community. Yet, since we are coming to the end of the lecture, I can only give a few hints. The greatest difference obviously lies in the isolation of Dasein in the face of its own finitude, emphasized by Heidegger, a privation that is intended to liberate the individual from being alienated by the everyday man. I don't know really, they translate it as they, but I guess you know the term. Alienated by the everyday man. Such liberating privation not only loses its meaning with regard to humanity as a whole, it even seems to advocate for the very form of particularity that, according to Marx, is the cause of alienation. Heidegger, though, can only understand isolation as liberation because he assumes an ontological structural wholeness of human existence, which in turn hinges on the absolute certainty of its finitude. In other words, the possibility of one's own death is distinguished from all other everyday possibilities by the fact that it is the only true certain one. Based on this certainty, Heidegger believes that he can ontologically ground his entire previous analysis of Dasein, and in doing so frees both the individual and his own philosophical approach from all cultural, social, and historical burdens. But precisely this is no longer possible when it comes to the human genus. Its death is anything but certain. It is merely, as Blanchot stresses, a probable improbable possibility, which appears historically for the first time with nuclear weaponry. In this respect, a collective being towards death cannot mean that a kind of universal social ontology of human existence is revealed in the anticipation of a probable improbable possibility of the apocalypse. Rather, the possibility of the death of the genus at the same time marks the end of all universality, and this also includes universality in the sense of an ultimate absolute certainty on which philosophy, including that of Heidegger, had traditionally been based. Thus, by contrast, an apocalypse that is not disappointing would, together with the finitude and radical historicity of the universal, also reveal the end of all those unifying principles that want to finally determine the totality of humanity as a totality, and thus close it off from the future. Such an apocalypse would thus be a revelation without an end, an apocalypse without apocalypse, as Derrida put it in his reading of Blanchot. A liberated humanity would therefore have to assemble without a final point of reference and without any final certainties. In order for this to happen, and this seems to be Blanchot's point, humanity must nonetheless learn to conceive of itself as a totality or genus in the first place, but in a radically different way than it has been thought of in philosophy so far. The question is, of course, whether the threat of nuclear annihilation that Blanchot envisioned in the 1960s or other contemporary apocalyptic scenarios are capable of developing such a revolutionary force today. This is anything but certain, but it remains possible, as much as what could be called, for lack of a better name, the communism of the nearest future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Quadflieg. So I open the floor for questions and comments. Okay, Cosima.
Thank you for an excellent lecture. I had two questions, of which I encourage you to pick only one.
That's very generous.
The first is perhaps a little trivial, but I couldn't help but call to mind for the second part of your talk the famous Zizek quote, perhaps best popularized by Mark Fisher, that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism.
Yes.
And I was wondering if there was perhaps a reformulation or at least some comment in light of your talk on that. And my second question is, you noted at the beginning the sort of current, let's say, the apocalypse du jour, if you will, of the Anthropocene. And I am familiar with some writing, for instance, on the bathos of the Anthropocene, how compared to previous apocalypses, it seems to be a lot more subtle and unexciting, if not more disappointing. And I suppose my question is, on that, whether you feel it makes sense to compare the characters of apocalypses, the nuclear to the environmental,
Yes.
and perhaps in that consider whether it makes sense to speak of a recent historical development of the potential relation of totality, whether there was a modulation of this radical possibility of self-destruction.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wish I hadn't answered to the first question immediately or right away, but I think I could side with that if you read it slightly differently. So if you take this, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, would exactly be the way that Blanchot accuses Jaspers. So Jaspers could you could think of Jaspers as an easy way of thinking the end of the world. So this is, I think, exactly what Blanchot tries to show. So if you have a look, I had a look at this book by Jaspers. It's really hard to read right now, but because it has kind of a demanding tone, right? Every individual has now the duty to think differently, blah, blah, blah. And then, but the form of the text is in a way, and what he's thinking about is kind of seems to be totally traditional in a way, or something, nothing new, right? So the opposites that he's working with, and between freedom and totalitarianism is nothing, in a way, nothing new. So this is something like the political situation as it was. And in this respect, one could say this holds still true. Maybe one can turn, thank you for reminding me of this phrase. One could also just turn it around and say, if we want to think of the end of capitalism, we have to think differently of the end of the world. Something like that would be the Blanchot's or my answer to that. And the second question raises a lot of second and third and so on questions. There is, of course, a difference between this kind of nuclear apocalypse that Blanchot had in mind and, for example, climate change and this kind of apocalyptic tone that sometimes shows up in nowadays. That has to do with I think we don't have a kind of image what the end of the world would mean in the sense of a climate change. I mean, there are scenarios, but it's not like this kind of stereotypes that you have for an atomic apocalypse. All these films about this and novels and so on and so forth. So yeah, there is, and this also means that this has an impact. So what I was aiming at and also I think what Alenka Zupancic had in mind when reading Blanchot's text again is that at least sometimes in our current debate about climate change and what it does to our way of living, in the end ends a little bit like Jaspers, like trying to save the way of our living, inventing new technologies. We just have to use technology to overcome this carbonate industry, and then we can go on, right? So, and I think this is something that brings these two forms of apocalypse together, or could be in a more political way, that we may think of the problem of climate change not as something like we have to stop this and this and that, but maybe we have to think totally differently what it means to be a human genus, as I tried to say, right? What it means to be, that this is something that the humanity as a whole is concerned with. And so maybe there's something that brings these two problems together again. Yeah. But of course, it is much more difficult to think about climate change in the way as the end of the world, because it's like it's stretched in time in a way that is unforeseeable, in a way. You can either say it's not happening, right?
Well, I have a question based on observation that you might agree with or not, but I would say that the observation would be that recently that, well, you kind of pointed in the same direction, that recently the images are more of a, like this post-civilizational dystopia than total destruction of.
Yeah.
So you have like Last of Us, I mean Fallout, so something survives, and or Mad Max. This is what we are fascinated by it now, as opposed to this Cold War imaginarium of total annihilation.
Yeah.
So first, do you agree? Second, what would be your take on this?
maybe it's too early to really say something about it. Maybe you have to wait a little. I mean, this is the wrong stance in this. But I mean, more from the theoretical point, it would be interesting to see, for example, movies coming up or new series coming up. I guess this will soon happen, that we have a kind of new form of dealing with that, and then take that as a form of cultural expression, and try to see something in how this is perceived, what narratives come up. I mean, this is cannot be the political answer. It's more the question of what is happening right now, and sometimes you can see that much better in, as I said, in movies or novels or something like that, because these are, of course, the medium of imagination, and I have to think about it. Maybe it would be worth doing some research on that and looking. So, what is there a new form of thinking about dystopia associated with climate change coming up? What are the images of that? What does it say about how people relate themselves to this possible end? Maybe there is a kind of, and what you suggest is seems to be interesting.
Further hypothesis would be that there seem to be more and more like a commentary on the present, or it's less and less meant as some future state. It's more like it's a slightly exaggerated current situation. So so it's as if we learn to live the apocalypse or the
and it's a kind
as opposed to something that will come eventually.
Yes.
I have a
Go on.
brief question in relation to what you just mentioned. So, imagination and the question on imagination and future possibilities of communism in Blanchot's sense. Now, there is a trend nowadays to talk about of crisis in imagination. So we cannot even imagine a future, or in the sense of new societal forms, or forms of the common civil society and so on. It's easier to stick to the apocalypse. And then parallel to this, there is a growing number of books in philosophy on imagination as well, namely how imagination changes our attitude towards thinking, also thinking new societal forms, especially in connection to Kant's third critique and the idea of Gemeinsinn. For example, Italian scholars, Ferrerin, just to name one, or also in Potsdam, what they are doing. I think there are evolving projects on precisely the question of imagination and the importance of imagination and imagining the new forms of the common. So I was just thinking, rather broad question, what's your standpoint towards this question? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, so the first thing is, you're right, if that would be the outcome, so just stick with the apocalypse, and then you're kind of on the same side, because you don't have to think of how a better society would look like. Then something would have gone terribly wrong with my paper if this is the outcome of that. It's more like so in this case, and for Blanchot, the apocalypse is something like a kind of thinking about the ultimate, and the ultimate end is something that should kind of wake up or make new things possible. So like this old slogan, a new world, another world is possible, without saying how this world would look like, right? But maybe this also relates to Martin's question. And also, so maybe a little bit also to Cosma's question. One could, yeah, I see. So one could come to another diagnosis. So we are so used to all these apocalyptic scenarios that we are not shocked anymore. So it's part of the culture. The end is near. Yeah, but we just go on, or it's the end of the world as we know it, la la la, and we turn it into a pop song or something like this. So I love REM, so this is not, but still, right? So it's kind of present. There's a present of the end of the apocalypse, but maybe for Blanchot it was, or in the 60s, it was kind of really a threat that was that many people experience, but now, so we got kind of used to it. And that would be, for this project, this would be horrible in a way, because this is kind of, it is kind of sought up by this, by just going on, right? So just let's do what we are used to do, and the apocalypse is, we're living think of the apocalypse as a good friend of our present or something like that. Yeah, I see. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we have to think about it. And this is, I think it's not, maybe not a theoretical question in a strict sense. It's more, it's kind of also a question of cultural research and, I mean, or sociological research. So how do people think about this? Is that something that we so get used to? Maybe even also what I just mentioned in media and so on, that we don't, that it doesn't have this effect anymore that Blanchot had in mind.
But it's also part of our thinking about ourselves and our relation to the world. So it has to do with the poem of thoughts as well.
Now, and this just a brief or very short answer to the question of the imagination. So if I combine these questions, you could say, or maybe that is what you intended also, maybe there's also an alternative, right? It's not about just mere possibilities, but we need an image of what this other world or this humanity could look like. It's not just opening kind of a form of alienation that is blocking us. It's not just the opening of a blockade, but to open it, we need an image of something new. But then all these questions arise again. So what are the sources of this image? Maybe they're in the end all too familiar, or they just extend what we have right now. But thank you. Yeah, this is, and you're right. So I've recently, there are more groups in Germany, also research groups that work on the political imagination. Also, I think in Jena there's also, or somewhere there's also a group. Yeah, you're right. This is an interesting new development. Yes. Thanks. Yeah, very good.
Thank you, Dirk, for the lecture. I would go a little bit more or less in the same direction, although not referring back to imagination, but to understanding. You had a lecture on communism, possibility of totality, and ending with Heidegger. And then you know, this idea of Heideggerian communism may seem odd at first sight, but in fact it is, I would say, not so unexpected. It's rather common. Why? Because Heidegger is the philosopher of, you know, thinking radically differently, thinking opening to something completely different, not to continue the way we did till now. We need something, a new opening, and this opening has sometimes a name, and this is communism. Mm-hmm. But then, isn't that precisely the way how, and I think that the left Heideggerianism or Heideggerian communism instantaneous illustrates the problem. Isn't that precisely the way how to prevent something like communism to come closer? because we could say the other way around. Nothing changes because precisely we want to think radically different, because we want to, and I would now use another metaphor, jump to reason directly, without first going through the instance of understanding. And I think that your reference to understanding here was very, very, I would say, productive. Because if we want to change the world, I would say, we cannot wait or imagine something completely different. We have to do something. And we have to do something with the world it is, not with the world, with the means of the world that is going to happen. This is why I would much rather refer to Brecht, who said something like that. You cannot sail with the wind of tomorrow. You can sail only with the wind of today. But as it is now, you can sail with the wind against the wind. And this is something that I would propose, to work with the world as it is in order to change it. And this would be, in my view, the position of understanding. And if we go to make another comparison, is the relation between socialism and communism. Communism is that completely other, direct use of reason, while the socialism usually, things appears though, why to deal with socialism? Let us go for communism. But communism is easy, because this is only the principle of Prinzip der Hoffnung, the principle of hope, to have something completely different, to work out the way how to go on to change the world as it is. This is the difficult task of the question, I would say, and this is something that involves understanding, and this is something that has a name, I would say, socialism. So my question to you would be how this non-Heideggerian communism or Heideggerian communism relates to socialism. And one more comment with the idea, which is so widespread today, of how it is easier to imagine the end of the world as the end of capitalism. Well, I don't think this is the case. This is, I would say, pardon me, a bullshit. Why? Because we had a different world, and that was socialism. At least here we had it. And no, if the esse ad posse valet consequentia, if it was at least in part real, then it is possible. And then we have a way to imagine the end of capitalism. And what bothers me is this sticking on the notion of the narrative of, oh, we cannot imagine the end of capitalism. Yes, we do, but we strive not to think about it. So the question would be where you locate socialism in this.
But if the last sentence is right, then it's just a problem of politics and praxis. Then it's not a theoretical problem. Then it's really the end of philosophy. So if we know what the end of capitalism would be like, then it's just a question of practically bringing it about. Then we are here, then we are superfluous here, right? So I mean, then you just go and form a party, whatever, because you know what is to be done. And I'm not sure if we know what is to be done. At least I'm personally, I don't know. I'm just thinking about it. So this is the problem. So that you could say I don't have that problem. I know what is to be done. I know what the nearest future would look like. The principle of movement would look like. If you know that, then this is not a problem of theory, I would say. Then it's really a problem of politics and praxis. There's nothing that, as a philosopher, you can do anything. You can keep talking about it, but this will change nothing. The only thing that makes philosophy, I don't want to say possible, but is a legitimization for thinking about this theoretically, is that we don't know how the nearest future would look like, that we don't know what a human world would look like. And my suggestion is just to say, you don't have to think of it in the sense of there is an image somewhere. We just have to find it and then apply it to reality. But my idea is more to get rid of these blockades that prevent us from thinking different and acting differently. And this is, at least in part, also a task, a philosophical or theoretical task. But sure, if you think that the socialism that has been realized was a good idea, then you can then you know how to do it, because it has been done, right? I'm not so sure about this. If this is something that we can just go back to and think, okay, some things have gone wrong, but they were not imminent to the way it was tried to bring this possibility to reality, then we just have to keep away from these false decisions and try to do it a second time, if you wish, or repeat it in a better way. But yeah, I think this is a question of how you relate to these questions, and yeah, I can only repeat myself. I'm not so sure about this, and I want to think of it differently. And it's not. I mean, I know that you were not fond of the Heidegger quote, and I was thinking of leaving it out because it brings something in the end that is really not important. So forget about Heidegger. I just wanted to say there is a kind of model we can think about, but this model is not sufficient. This is all I wanted to say at that point. It's not, I didn't want to say we have to think it in a Heideggerian way and then we are there. I wanted to say the exact opposite. But sometimes Heidegger is just like triggers that much that it just, so everything I said is just completely under this big name. And this is, I know this is dangerous. This is totally dangerous. This is why I skipped the quote. So in the end, I'm on Hegel's side, of course. I just wanted to say there is a thinking of wholeness that is connected to the end and to the idea of freedom. And maybe this structure makes something more comprehensible, or it's another perspective of seeing it. And what I tried in the last paragraph was just to say, but there are a lot of difference between this way of thinking, this kind of radical possibility. Namely, if you try to think about it on the scale of humanity, you can't think of an ontology, for example, anymore. And if you try to think it with Blanchot as an historical event and not as a kind of structure of Dasein as such, then you can start thinking about it. So what we just did, so is that our situation now? Maybe it isn't. I mean, there are good reasons why maybe we cannot think about it in this way anymore, because this thinking of the end is kind of, nobody bothers anymore. So yeah, right. I think this is, to come back to your question, yeah. So leave Heidegger aside. It's not important here. This is all I can say about it. I'm not a Heideggerian in this sense. I just wanted to use that to think about something.
I think that we are.
There's a final question. Thank you.